definition of what do we mean by public policy. And you know, public policies, like I said before, it can be a law that you actually are passing. Those statutes and ordinances, regulations, permits and licenses, those are all can happen both at the local and state level. There are economic decisions around budgets. You know, there was some woman that I talked to in Minnesota a while back who was saying that they knew that their council had made it when they became a line item in the budget. And I think that's actually a really great marker of, you know, yes, that you're seriously, we take you serious enough, and we really feel like it's important to fund this work. And so that actually that's a policy decision, how you make those decisions. Trade agreements are typically global in nature, but can oftentimes have an impact on how food is being procured at the local and state level. And so it's something to pay attention to. What kinds of academic enterprises get funded also is a decision that is a policy decision. As we're seeing now with our current administration, and that actually, you know, there's some funding going away for some of the local and regional food systems work that have been previously funded under USDA. And so getting that funded scholarship is actually kind of a policy win-win that does happen. And then statements of intention or direction can be anything like an executive order or a resolution. They're not necessarily binding, but they are sort of statements of intent. Like you want to, like we are working together as a city or a county to improve our food system, and we are going to have an official, you know, get on board with this and make that statement. So that also is a policy decision. And why is it important? So programs, you know, there really isn't, I think one thing to kind of like suspend is this idea is you're either doing programs or policy. So I always like to say, don't think binarily when you're looking at this work, sort of think of the how these all kind of weave together and the importance of all of them. And so programs people understand, and it's really important to have that program experience and the program perspective on your council because they're trying to do the actual work in the field. So that piece of it does a lot around individual norms, empowering communities, et cetera. Definitely a really important piece. When you get to the policy piece, as I said before, policy actually does look at how are we all going to benefit. There's something happening in our environment that is causing a problem or maybe not causing a problem. We don't have any policy on this, but it potentially is affecting the way that things are operating across the board. And so policy has the opportunity to improve that environment for a bunch of different entities or organizations or individuals, as opposed to just a program that's working, you know, maybe one-on-one or working with, you know, a particular audience. So the goal with policy is to kind of look at a bigger picture and say, what's preventing this from happening? And is it possible that a policy change could make a difference in improving this? So the goal is you're raising all boats. It's influencing across the different sectors. There sometimes policies are revenue neutral. A lot of policies these days at the state level get passed without any funding or appropriation, so it's very difficult to actually implement those because there's no resources. And so when there's a cost, unfortunately, a lot of times those policies don't end up passing because there's a cost associated with them, and so they don't even wait till the appropriations period. So it is important to think about, there's whole criteria around how you can get policy funded or what do you look for, but I think those are kind of the broader picture of why it's important. And then I'm going to just leave with this last slide, which is these different scales of policy, and that it's one of the things that no matter what scale you're working at, it's great to pay attention to and understand how does your scale of work interact with these other scales. Are there institutions out there that you could be working with if you're working at the local scale? What kind of funds go through the state level that you need to be aware of? What kind of funds are coming from the federal level that would actually reach local communities but actually have to go through a state department? And sometimes these state departments don't even know that. And so it's really good to become familiar with how your government is operating so you can better advocate on behalf of whatever entity or whatever group you're working with. So I'm going to turn it over to Karen now.
Hello. We're going to transition a little bit from talking about some of these larger concepts of kind of what food policy councils do and what they focus on and why they work on policy and why it's important to understand kind of this notion of systems, to what are some of the key elements that help councils to function effectively. And these are elements that it's important to consider when you're starting out. They're also elements that are important to revisit or think about as your council grows and changes and develops over time as well. They help to kind of keep the council moving forward and guided. and give you a check on who's involved and how is that influencing what the priorities are and how your council progresses and works on either programs, policies, or develops new partnerships. So one of the key elements is leadership. How is your council structured? What is the structure that you're using, and how do you engage members in terms of building their capacity to be leaders, in terms of helping to set that structure, keeping people together, bringing them together? There are several different models that are used by councils. There's no one size fits all. Like Anne said, councils come in kind of all different sizes, shapes, models, from grassroots organizations to nonprofits to ones that are embedded in government. And so the structure of the council kind of varies depending on the context in which you're working in and kind of who you're aligned with and affiliated with. If you're a council that is part of government and you're an advisory committee, you may have stricter criteria that you have to follow because there are parameters of being a board or a commission of a city government. In other cases, there are lots of other opportunities to have a more flexible structure. You know, two models that are kind of typical is one is the hierarchical model where you have a president and vice president or co-chairs that sit at the top, and then you have kind of these working groups or decision groups below that, and then you have other groups that fall underneath that. With councils, we typically see them that they may have a steering committee of a couple of members, and then they have working groups that are either organizationally focused on fundraising or outreach, or they're focused on policy priorities like food access issues, food literacy, environmental sustainability, agriculture. Another model that's a little bit more co-sharing of power is a more flat model where your power is shared between leaders and members of your council, where you have two co-chairs, you have split responsibilities. You also may have work group chairs, and those chairs report back to the larger committee. So there's not necessarily a steering committee, but you have this broader network of all of the members that participate in decision making and moving the council forward. And then the work gets divided between these work groups, and they're really kind of the doers or the worker bees that are working on how you implement changes or implement programs or policies, but they report back to this larger group, and everyone shares in the decision making and recommendations moving forward. So really, as you think about your council, part of deciding on your leadership model is what fits best with kind of the priorities and where you're headed, and how do you want to make decisions? And with the flat model, there's lots more opportunities to engage members and build their capacity to be leaders and make decisions. And it also helps with some of the issues of transition. So when you're changing from one chair or co-chair to another chair or co-chair, make sure that kind of the power doesn't live with a couple of members, and when they leave, it leaves a vacuum in terms of institutional knowledge or energy moving the council forward, but that it's shared amongst the members and someone can easily transition into that position and carry the council forward. The next key element is kind of having a shared vision. Why are people coming to the table? What brings them to be a part of this council? What is it that long-term they're really looking at and imagining? And is everyone on the same page with that image? If you're not, you're going to have disparate projects happening and people making decisions about things that don't necessarily align with the rest of the group. It may be a pet project that they want to work on and they're bringing it to the table because they think they can get support from a larger group to work on it, but does it really align with that bigger idea of what your food system for your community should look like? And taking time to really kind of think about what is it that the bigger images and the picture is that you're heading towards will help to guide the work of your council. It helps you to set your priorities. It helps you to figure out, kind of, do activities and actions that we're taking, do they align with this vision? Or is it something that, you know, we really want to focus on, put money and energy and effort into because it gets us towards this kind of overarching idea of where we want to head with our food system. So it's important to think big. It gives people kind of energy and excitement because they want to make these changes, but it also is a check and balance between the work of the council and what people are working on. Membership. There's a lot of questions about membership, and every council has a different number of members, different types of members, different ways that they engage them. Many councils start with kind of who is working in our food system from an organizational perspective and bring those people to the table. Some councils start with who's in our community that are affected by the issues and how do we engage them and bring them into the conversation. And this is something that we see, membership changes a lot with councils because there are terms that are set and people rotate on and off, and you get people that get fatigued and want to move out of the council, and so your membership is constantly changing. But it is a question of who do you have at the table and how does that person kind of align with the vision, and how do they help to forward it with the work that they do or the knowledge that they have or the skills that they bring to the table. So some ways that members are engaged in councils is either there is an application process where anyone is open and anyone is welcome to apply. And then there's a committee that decides who would fit best on the council. They can be appointed. Oftentimes when a council is embedded in government, we see these positions as appointed from the city council or county commissioners. So they're elected by the officials to serve on this council and advisory role. That tends to it can work two ways in being a benefit and a kind of a barrier for councils in terms of that if it's a politically motivated person that's put into that position, they may not align or share the vision of the council. And so it might kind of make conversations challenging or change the conversation of the council and what they're working on. With the council in Douglas County, Kansas, they do have some appointed members, but they also have it open to where they have seats designated for different sectors of the food system. And those members, they're not appointed by city or county, but they're able to apply or they're sought out to serve on the council. So there's a nice balance between being politically motivated in terms of who's on the council and also bringing in other entities from the larger community. And then for a lot of councils, as they try to kind of figure out what their structure is, where they're headed, their membership is open. And it's partially because they're going to take who's available, willing, and interested to get started. And that's not a bad thing because you have the energy and momentum and you have the interest of people wanting to do this work. And as your council evolves, you can put more structure behind your membership. But you have a willing, engaged, energetic group that wants to get started and wants to move forward. So some questions and things to consider is kind of, do you know why those members are there, why they're coming to the meetings, what they want to do, what their kind of impetus is for being a part of the council, and really thinking through kind of, do you have the right skills present at the table? People bring the right experience and knowledge to the table that's going to contribute to moving the council forward, helping it to decide on the priorities, having the capability, the capacity, possibly the funding that helps to initiate projects or activities and move policy forward. When you consider membership, also kind of recognize people are coming to this with their own agenda sometimes, and you want to keep them all aligned so that everyone's moving together. And some ways of doing that are really having clearly defined roles and expectations for members. Why are they there? Do they know why they're there, what role they fulfill, what the commitment or expectation is? And some of this helps to make sure that you have members that are accountable to serving on the council. They're not there in name only, but there is some level of recognition that they have to serve in some capacity. They have to show up to meetings, they have to participate, they have to vote in decisions. And so setting those terms and ground rules before members join helps to keep people engaged because they know what's expected of them and they can manage those expectations. So in addition to considering these factors, there's a lot of questions that you can ask as you think about your membership. And this is not as you're getting started, this is kind of as your council progresses and changes and develops. These are questions that you can always come back to in terms of reflecting on, do we have the right people at the table? Are we heavily sided with a lot of government people at the table? And what does that do in terms of our engagement of community members? Is there an open spot for them to provide input, or do they feel that they don't have that space to be able to communicate and share their opinions? Does your council reflect the community? Are you representative kind of the demographics that are dynamics that are within your community? And if not, how do you invite those people to be a part of the conversation? Or is it that, there's a lot of outreach that needs to happen to bring them into the conversation, or you need to go to them and be a part of their conversations as well? Really, how do you balance between policymakers, food system stakeholders, community members, for your council, for your area, for the priorities that you're looking at? What is that right kind of balance of members? Excuse me. Also, how many people will serve on your council? They range in numbers from like 9 people on the council to the LA Food Policy Council has over 200 members. And part of that's because they have an open structure where anyone can come and participate in the conversations. They have to go through some level of training and understand where the council is in terms of their work, so that they're not repeating the same conversation over and over again. But it does mean that they have this very broad base of interest and engagement within their council. How will your members be selected? Are they appointed? Do you want them to go through an application process? Do you want it to be open to anyone that has an interest in joining? And then how are they going to be engaged? What are their roles? What are their expectations? And how do you communicate with them? Communication is one of those key factors as well in terms of keeping people engaged. Is how are you sharing information? It affects your leadership structure. How is information getting communicated up and down that ladder? How is it getting communicated across sectors and work groups? And also, how are you sharing this information about your council out to the larger general public so that they know the value, so that they know that you're working on? It keeps kind of the relevancy and the credibility of the council going, and shows the community that you are you're working and you're grappling with these harder issues around your food system. So those are three kind of really big criteria for councils that you know, they're things that you should grapple with when you start your council. There are also things to consider ongoing. It's not uncommon for councils to reform or reshape their structure in some way because their priorities change, because their membership changes, because the political landscape changes. And so it's, you know, there's always an opportunity to check in and reflect on, is this structure, is this our membership, do we have the right people at the table, does this work for us, or do we need to change things and modify them and adapt to how our council grows and changes. So now we want to kind of jump from these big grand ideas to some concrete examples of what councils are doing in the field. Every year we survey the councils across the US and Canada. There are about 260 in the US, and it gives us an idea of what are organizational structures of councils, who sits at their table, and what policy priorities or topics are they interested in or engaged in right now. And this chart shows is a picture of what the policy priorities have been for councils in 2015 and 2016. And really, we see a lot of councils working on issues related to healthy food access, be that access at farmers markets and double dollar benefits at markets, or access to grocery stores in underserved or food desert areas. Excuse me. And then the other area that we've seen a lot of activity is around land use planning, and a lot of this involves zoning or planning for urban agriculture or food production within an urban environment. But again, these are pretty broad categories, and the range of topics that councils are engaged in vary a lot, and they also change a lot over time as well. We're seeing a lot more interest in food waste and recovery, and some more growing interest in terms of labor topics, but the councils that are working on those right now are small, but we know that they're an interest, and so this keeps evolving over time as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anne. She's going to talk about Douglas County.
Yeah, we're going to go through some examples now. Should we take questions first? Or do the examples? Do you all, any of you have any questions on what we've talked about so far? And I think you can unmute yourselves. There you go. If you go to the top of the screen, you can either, slides will be made available. Yeah.
And just so you know, there's a few people who have the older version of Zoom, so it won't allow me to unmute them. So they'll have to.
Oh, okay.
But the majority of the people have the ability to speak.
Okay. Okay. I guess we'll go ahead and go on with the examples, and then see if there's any questions after that. So Douglas County, Kansas has been around for a number of years, actually. They are one of them, I think one of the more active, I mean, not one of the older, but they've been very active. They've done a lot of work. They are a part of government now, and the interesting thing, they have, it's across states, right? They have a county and city. County and city government, yeah. So it is both the county and city contribute to the position to fund the council. They have designated seats for agricultural producers, and also for everyone. I think that all of their membership is actually designated. They have a food systems plan that was completed in 2017. They did a feasibility study for a food hub in their area, and it was multiple counties, obviously, but that hub has not been built yet. They're still in trying to plan that out, I believe. And they would, this is out of the survey, would talk about their challenges. It's sort of educating community leaders on why planning and policy matter. And then they have a recent law that was passed, a state preemptive law about whether or not local jurisdictions, basically saying local jurisdictions can't make decisions about what was it, public health and something else. There was another area. So it was very strange. Kansas is a fairly, their governor, Sam Brownback, is pretty conservative, and they have been, rather than wanting them to have any authority over it, they basically passed this very strange preemption law that has been a challenge for the state to move forward in some of their policies. Karen's going to do Madison.
And another example of a council that's embedded in government is the Madison Food Policy Council. They were formed in 2012. They're part of the city, so not the county, but they're a city council, advisory council to, and they were formed, I said that in 2012. One of the things about Madison, and they've been very active and able to pass several policies related to healthy retail access. They have some seed grant funding that they get from the government, from the city government, in order to support retail businesses moving into what they've identified as basically food desert areas, provide technical assistance. They also have some funding for other kind of community gardening initiatives and other seed projects within the city, and all of their funding comes out of the city appropriations, out of the general fund. One of the unique things about their council is that their mayor has been very supportive of the council from the start. And so that gives them a lot of leverage and a lot of opportunities, because they have a champion that wants to work on these issues and wants to see progress on them. And he's the head of the U.S. Conference of Mayors Food Policy Task Force, and has a kind of national presence around food policy within the in supporting the council. One of the interesting things, though, is that they've gotten a lot of funding for projects, and they haven't gotten a lot of funding for the council. So recently they received a $10,000 grant from the city to fund work of the council so that it's not all volunteer run. And funding helps councils to go a long way. We know from our survey that the majority of councils have a budget that's below $10,000. So everyone's kind of eking by on this minimal amount of funding to keep going, because they have very engaged and committed volunteers working on their projects. So working with your city to get funding to support some of the initiatives is one of the activities that councils can do, not only supporting their work, but also supporting projects or seed grants, within the community.
Worcester Food Policy Council is in Massachusetts, and they've been around, I want to say, about 8 years as well. They're a nonprofit organization, but they actually had their mayor issue a decree that was acknowledging them, so that we were talking about what is the policy, and that there was like some sort of city resolution. They have seats for government officials. They've worked on urban agriculture. They are one of the few groups, I think, that's actually worked on advocating for minimum wage. This was at the state level. And then these last three, the Massachusetts Food Trust, the School Nutrition Legislation, and the Massachusetts Food Policy Council at the state level, they were part of that, and one of the key groups, I think, that helped to advocate for the two legislative actions. The Massachusetts Food Trust is basically like the healthy food financing fund for the state of Massachusetts. The School Nutrition Legislation, I don't remember specifically what that was, but they were helped to advocate for that. And then they have a state level food policy council and Worcester has been active on that as well.
So Pittsburgh it is embedded in the extension office in Pittsburgh, and that's kind of its fiscal agent and sponsor and administrator. It operates more like a kind of nonprofit organization or a grassroots council, in that they have a lot of flexibility in terms of working on policy issues, which extension doesn't normally have a whole lot of flexibility in working on policy issues. It's kind of taboo, but because they're kind of this extended arm of extension that serves as their fiscal and administrative sponsor, it gives them a little more flexibility to do some of the more advocacy work that they've been doing a great job of. They were formed in 2009. They do operate within the city of Pittsburgh, although kind of their perspective is growing to see that they might need to take on some issues of the surrounding county as well. They recently went through an extensive process of restructuring their council. Part of it's because they want to have more community voices coming in and being a part of the council, and they don't want to be limited just to kind of having an application and getting whoever's there nominated, but they want to open it up so that more people can contribute to the work that they're doing. So the diagram on the screen is a little complicated, but basically they have a main steering committee that has 8 members that make a lot of the decisions for the council, and then they have work groups. And their work groups are decided based on what their priorities are. So right now they have 3. One's focused on urban agriculture, the other one is on food access, and then there's one on the regional food economy. Both the urban access and urban agriculture and food access committees have a hired coordinator that helps to steer the work of the work group and keep it moving forward. And all of the work groups report back to the steering committee. They're not decision-making bodies, but they make recommendations of how the council can move forward. And then surrounding that is kind of this general council of more than 80 members that participate in kind of larger standing meetings of the council to just hear what's happening with the work groups, to hear how the council is moving forward, to kind of provide their input on what's happening with their organizations or within their communities. But they also are not a decision-making body. They serve as kind of information and help with some of the work of the work groups. So one of the bigger successes of the council was an update to their agricultural zoning code. There were some limitations on the plot sizes that could be used for urban agriculture within the city. They also limited the ability to grow food on an urban farm or in a community garden in residential areas, and did not permit bees, chickens, ducks, or goats. And so they found that while they had gone through a process of updating the urban agriculture code years ago, it still didn't meet the needs of the community because it was still particularly restrictive. And so they partnered with a couple of organizations in Pittsburgh. I think one of them is called Grow Pittsburgh, and also with the planning department to do some surveying of residents to find out kind of what were the tweaks that needed to be made to this code that would help them, enable them to be able to produce more food within the city limits and in residential areas. And so the planning department put forward some of the recommendations to the city council to make the changes, and then the council and other organizations brought forward testimony in order to change the zoning code. And it was successful and passed. And what came out of this is they now have a guide of how do you work within the parameters of this urban agriculture code if you want to grow and sell food within the city of Pittsburgh. And so their role has shifted from advocacy to more implementation and helping to educate community members that want to participate and benefit from the changes in their agriculture code.
And now we're going to just go over a little bit about sort of policy criteria. And so one of the things that if you're at that stage where you want to start working on policy, there are questions to ask yourselves about what is it, how are we going to decide what to work on? And so these are just some of the things you could consider. Just is it something that reflects the shared vision and mission for the group? Is there a consensus among the members of your food policy council or your food council? And most of these groups are consensus driven, and so that's kind of an important piece. You tend not to work probably on more controversial policies where they're going to be very divisive. Does it align with any other community initiatives that are going on that you can be building on? So a lot of groups also don't necessarily work on their own policy, but then they will work with other organizations that are more policy focused and can choose to get on board and support those policies, or maybe the individuals within the council would support those policies or from their organization. So there's a lot of ways that you can rely on your other partners to do policy where it isn't about the group doing it itself. Is the criteria responsive to a food plan or a strategic plan? These usually do not happen within the first couple of years. Usually it takes a while to have a food plan or a strategic plan in place, so don't panic if you don't have one, but sometimes that's how people use their criteria. Is there any data on the efficacy of the policy itself, or data on what the problem even is, because sometimes it's hard to get a hold of that kind of data. Do you have a champion behind it? Is there somebody who can be a good spokesperson? What's the potential for impact, either shorter or longer term? And then sort of what the feasibility is from a political, financial, or legal standpoint. And then finally, is it addressing social, economic, or environmental equity? What sort of opposition do you have? How hard is it going to be to communicate about the problem? Sometimes that can make it more difficult if you're going to try to build a base of constituents who would help you support it. And are there logical partners in addition to the constituent base? And did you want to talk about that? Yeah.
So policy criteria, those questions can help you to kind of figure out what are the focus that you want to have on terms of your work on policy. One of the councils, Washington Food Policy Council, which is in Michigan, they have in their bylaws a set of issue criteria, and this helps them to make decisions about the work that the council is going to do. Oftentimes you may have set priorities or a plan that's guiding the work of the council, but then there are all these other issues that may come up on the side, and how do you decide what are the salient problems and issues that you want to address. And so they have a list of questions that they ask when they make decisions about kind of does it further their vision? Is it immediate? Does it have an immediate impact? How will it affect the community, and helps them to make decisions of if they want to move forward or not. We don't see a whole lot of kind of these types of questions and issue criteria in a lot of the bylaws of councils. Oftentimes they'll say, you know, do we vote by consensus, or how many people need to be present to make a decision. But I thought this was kind of really helpful for councils to think about as they move forward in some of their policy and programs of how do you make decisions about what you want to work on.
And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about how to keep engaged. And this is one of the things I think that it's sort of a perennial problem for a lot of groups. So the long-term sustainability can be a piece of it, but these are just sort of suggestions that we've come up with over the years in talking to people. And so I think having a really good facilitator, if you yourself are the leader and not facilitating, it can be a great way to keep people engaged, because that person can really focus on what's going on, the energy in the room, versus trying to keep tabs on the content piece of it. So that can be important. The other piece that we've really mentioned more and more to people is that, most groups are divided into committees, and the work tends to happen in the committees, but that those committees can be obsolete over time. And so if that committee's worked on something and doesn't need to be meeting anymore, let the committee go. Like, take some time every year to kind of review where you are and decide what you should keep doing and what maybe you shouldn't do anymore. Maybe this committee has been beating its head against the wall, not getting anywhere, or the leadership isn't good or whatever, and you just are like, this is time to be over. Let's just let it die. That is a great time to do that. So start thinking about how you can kind of build those feedback loops into your council so you can know when to do that. Making sure everybody contributes. I'm not going to go into specifics. We have some really good resources on our website about how you engage people, especially so it's not just the loudest voice or the one that's always going to be speaking up. Only their perspective is heard. There's a lot of ways to do that that can be very effective and really helpful in making sure that you're getting good representation. Actionable agenda items. Educational pieces. I think it's great to bring in outside speakers and people who everyone could benefit from hearing from. Make time for networking. No matter how interesting or engaging a meeting is, it's always great to sit around and have time to talk and get to know people. So we recommend that you always build that into your meeting time. And then last but not least, if you can, bring food or have people take turns bringing food. And so I think that's our last slide.
No, there's a toolkit.
Oh, okay, yeah. Oh yeah, so and then quickly, we have put together an evaluation toolkit that we launched about 6 months ago that I recommend you look at if you wanted to kind of get a baseline understanding of what your group, where your group is at. It's really, the intention is to just kind of start a dialogue. If you were to do, you can go in, it's on Qualtrics, it's really easy to do. There's 6 different sections. You can just do one section if you want to kind of get that, and that would take you like 10 minutes maybe for your members to do. If you did the entire toolkit, it takes usually about an hour, but you can have a number of groups. So there's a group in Virginia who's just their whole group is gonna do this right now, and they will use that. We'll give them back the metrics and look where they are, and then they can see is there consensus on where we are and what we can do to move forward. So that's it. No, one more. Almost done.
So we're putting in a shameless plug. We, as a National Resource Hub, we have a database full of resources related to food policy councils and food policy that's publicly accessible and searchable. We also have a listserv, which is a platform for conversation with other food policy councils. It is moderated, so you're not getting a bunch of emails all the time that are unrelated to the topic. And also, we have a directory of all the councils across the U.S. So if you're interested in seeing what other councils are doing in other jurisdictions, you can search that directory and find out. And then one more shameless plug is that, like I said, every year we survey councils across the U.S. to understand what their structure looks like, what advocacy work they're doing, what are their policy priorities. And this helps us to inform resources that are created, research that we do. It also is a way for us to put together a report to show that you are part of a growing network across the U.S. And to help talk about the value of councils and the impact that they have on the food system. And you can see our report from 2016. It's in the database if you're interested. And with that, we'll open it up to questions.
I think we've got about 12 minutes for questions. Oh, Washtenaw. Got it. We spelled Washtenaw.
Thank you.
Incorrectly.
So there's a question, does the local government have to recognize an FPC? Is there a form to fill out?
No. I mean, I'd say about over a third are grassroots organizations, and I'd say by and large, most of those do not seek official government recognition. Some of them do, and some of them will already have it because they'll have policymakers participating. But there really isn't. I mean, you could decide that that's what you wanted to do. I mean, and there's certainly, I think it's always a great idea to try and have government employees participate or attend, because their perspective in terms of what's feasible and how do you understanding how your government works can be really important. But there's no requirement.
And there's no form to fill out for a government to recognize. A lot of times councils that are grassroots will have a plan or a charter that they work on, and they take it to the government to have them not authorize it, but kind of sign on and support it, and be a part of the distribution of that document or resource that they've created, and that gives them some sort of credibility or validity. Like Ann said, it's really important to engage government members on your council. It's a delicate balance too between government members and community members, but it also just getting to know your representatives, educating them about the food system and what it means and why it's important helps as you move forward and try to get priorities passed or get plans accepted to help kind of advance your priorities. What are good sections of government to reach out to work with an FPC? We see a lot of departments of public health and human services as members of food policy councils. A lot of it has to do with the connection between SNAP and WIC and public benefits, and then the issue of food access. Other ones are planning departments are really great. If you're working on urban agriculture, if you're working on anything that deals with siting grocery stores in underserved areas. They also do a lot of development of strategic or long-range plans for communities, and so having them as a part of the conversation is helpful too. Lesser so are like departments of transportation. There's an intersection in terms of public transportation and access to food, that if your council is interested in kind of addressing barriers in access to healthy foods, it's important to kind of engage your planning or your transportation departments in understanding what their jurisdiction is. Do they even know that food, that it's an issue, and kind of educating them on why food is something that they should potentially consider.
Economic development sometimes. I mean, it really depends if you're going to go with that type of a strategy. I mean, they're always helpful to have because they're looking at it from a perspective of, are these businesses feasible, et cetera.
We have another question, which is, our food policy group struggles with a sense of direction. A local nonprofit leads it and drives its direction, often regardless of other voices in opposition to their perspective. What suggestions do you have for those who are trying to move their councils forward when more powerful players stand in the way?
Wow, great question. I don't know. So you can respond if you want, but I don't know if this group has a plan in place, but one way to kind of start to make the point that you're trying to make, which is that, perhaps this is one of the issues we see sometimes when a food policy council is housed within another nonprofit, is the nonprofit has a hard time getting out of its own way to allow things to emerge from the council itself. So I think if you're feeling like there isn't really a plan in place and there's a need to have like a statement of intent or something like that, and to move forward in that direction, that I would start to address it by, let's look at what all the different partners in the room need. What is our, if there's a vision, mission, and then the lack of direction usually is around when, maybe when you all got started, you had a kind of a statement, but if it's been some time has gone by, that maybe that needs to be revisited. So you could look at that and say, let's think about where we want to go. Sometimes it's good to have those conversations, then this person or institution may not be amenable to this, but I do think that sometimes having a conversation with them one-on-one can be helpful, and explaining, some of your own frustration. I mean, there's one of my our community partners has a saying that if you're leading and nobody's following, you're just out taking a walk, which I think is kind of appropriate here, because there's a little bit of, if everybody kind of isn't happy with the way things are going and it's just being driven by one organization, that can give everybody pause and time to say, let's think about, is there a different way for us to be doing things? So if you wanted to respond to any of the time things, and I'll turn it over to Karen too and see if she has anything to add.
I think another way of doing it is opening your council up and making it more vulnerable to other voices coming in that may challenge that one dominant voice that's sitting there. So, how open is your council to having other members come? How open is your council to having the community come and talk as well? And do you do any kind of outreach or listening sessions with the community to get their buy-in, or hear what's happening with issues in the community? Kind of putting that dominant voice to the side and letting some others kind of come into the conversation may help to mitigate it, but it's, we've also seen councils just wait and outweight that person that has a dominant voice. There's one I'm thinking of that's nearby us, and part of it was that person was leading a lot of what they were doing, but they eventually stepped off. Their priorities changed, their time changed, and they stepped off of the council and made space for other newer members to come in, and it's changed the work of the council and the structure of the council as well, and they've been able to really reevaluate how they want to work in co-sharing of their leadership. So unfortunately, that's the long game and not a quick solution. But I think, setting up parameters or having a plan or direction also helps to guide those voices and kind of helps to mitigate them in some ways. The other question is, are there any grants you recommend applying for? Funding is always an issue for councils. It's an issue for nonprofits in general, but there's various ways that councils go about trying to get funding for their work. Some approach more family foundations that are in their region or area that might be sympathetic to food systems work, food access. There are some federal grants that are available for councils. They're a little bit cumbersome to apply for, but community food projects is one of them, and then there's also the food incentives, food insecurity nutrition incentives program, FINI, and that's a grant that funds food access work, particularly around with SNAP populations. There's also some, if you're doing producer work, there's the local food promotions program and the farmers market promotion program and a beginning farmer and rancher program, and also a value added program. All of these are federal grants that are administered through the USDA. Another one is working with your community, federally funded community hospitals, and I'm not going to get that right, to as they're going through the process of doing a community needs assessment and working on a community health improvement plan, are there priorities of that plan that align with the work of your council, and are there opportunities for the council to receive funding? And it may be more project-based funding than it is policy funding, but it also provides support for your council doing work in addressing food systems issues, and get that into the conversation of how we address health and how we look at preventative health measures.
And our theme next month is actually going to be on funding. So it would be great to hear if any of you have had success or challenges with funding. And for all the federal ones, typically what's happening is you get a position or you get someone's time allocated, and then that time can be contributed to the Food Council as well. We've worked with one group this last year on applying for a CFP grant. And so those groups are doing activities, but they're also trying to do some policy and advocacy work.
And I would say, because you're bringing together multiple stakeholders that might be from other organizations, don't forget to talk to those organizations about writing in the work of the council into grants that they may be looking for. Your time is also valuable, and the work of the council in doing policy and advocacy is also valuable, and it may not be something that their organization does directly, and so you're an extension of their work in addressing some of their priorities. A lot of times members are coming to the council because they have a stake in what's happening with that council and the priorities of that council and the work that they're doing. And so contributing to the financial stability of the council benefits them and their organization as well.
Any other questions?
We are, you know, if questions come up later on or you're looking for a specific resource and can't find it, you're more than welcome to reach out to us. Amanda has our email addresses and can share them with you. We're available for one-on-one conversations. We can do a Zoom chat with you also. So anything that comes up after this webinar, you're more than welcome to reach out to us.
All right, and if there's no other questions, we can go ahead and wrap up. I just want to say thank you, Ann and Karen. This was wonderful, and I think everybody got a lot out of it. It's really great talk for the group. And as I mentioned before, this was recorded and will be placed on the website to view later.
Great, thank you.
Nice to meet you all.